Don't you worry, the clip's about to begin, but don't forget to subscribe. Or else, don't make me turn this website around.
Ashley in Canada, thanks for waiting. You're on with David and Matt. How can we help?
Hey there, David and Matt. How's it going?
So doing pretty well.
Good. Glad to hear it. So I wanted to talk about Calvinism. I don't know if you... I imagine at least Matt is familiar with the word. David, you might be as well. But the idea basically that, it's faith and belief come not from you making a rational conclusion, but instead it's God himself who changes your mind. So, I want to change their mind, but... Or even if they're right, I want to know about it, obviously. But the only way, apparently, that I can know about it is not through any rational conclusion, but only because God strikes the knowledge into my brain and gives me faith.
Sure.
How do you even approach that?
I'll let Matt talk first. I have plenty of thoughts about this, but go ahead.
Okay. And for me, it's really easy. Calvinist, I'm largely in agreement with because they don't believe in free will, at least not in the libertarian notion. And so I'm on board with that, even though I'm a compatibilist. And I asked a Calvinist friend of mine once, why does he bother go around, preaching and sharing the word? And he's like, I don't have any choice. And I was like, okay, that's not just clever. That's, it's actually an honest answer. But if they're saying, hey, you don't change your mind, God changes your mind. That's something that would need to be proven. And I also don't know what impact that could possibly have, because if the only way for me to find and believe in a God is for God to reach down and mess with my brain some way, then I could never possibly be at fault for not believing, because now the onus is completely on God. And so when they tell me this, I'm like, why are you telling me this? Shouldn't you be taking this up with God? Hey God, why haven't you changed Matt's mind yet? And that's all I can think about that. What are you thinking, David?
I love Calvin. I love this starting with the trying to change somebody's mind who thinks that this is all up to what God's going to do. Like, that's so meta. Like, you can get into this is such a infinite recursion hall of mirrors type thing, because you will need to change that person's mind about how people's minds change. And then you're gonna have to go back one step from that and ask them, what are your evidence-based claims on how people change their mind? But at the same time, like, you're having a conversation about something that in itself, God is in control of how they're going to respond to it. It's a real opportunity to get into technique rebuttal, right? This is a chance to get them to see the process and it leads to these conclusions. It also harkens back to, until the 18th century, this was the predominant thinking in most cultures, that discovery is discovering something that the gods put into the world, and invention is taking inventory of discoveries. And the only original thoughts that can take place are in the thoughts of deities, and then they will then stick them in your head. And Calvinism is kind of a wild a Western offshoot of these ancient concepts that go back to the Greeks. And Socrates, one of the things that he got in trouble for, I think this gets lost sometimes in the telling of his story, is that, he was saying he was getting his thoughts not from the main gods, but from some alternate dimension that had better thoughts. And so he was getting them from the daemonia, so, demons. But for Greeks, demons weren't the same as for Christians, right? But he basically was saying, like, people from an alternate dimension give me better ideas than the Olympian gods. And they were like, that's weird, and you should probably die because you shouldn't bring demon thoughts into Athens. That's weird. So the debate there wasn't like, oh, you've got some challenging ideas. The debate was, you're bringing ideas from another dimension of deities, because nobody can have original ideas and nobody can change their mind because only gods do that. So it's kind of interesting that Calvinists are have a shade of that inside of their thinking. But I would say, if you're going to debate this, the fun thing is exactly as Matt said. This is just an evidence-based claim. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, there's going to be attitudes and values mixed in there that you could talk about separately. But the claim that this is happening, what is your evidence for this? How confident are you that this is true? What are your reasons for it? And they're probably going to fall back on things like religious texts, right? And they're going to say, well, this is where this comes from. So now you have to back up the processing from there. Why do you have confidence that this text is a trustworthy source? Where does that come from? And then you're going to have reasons for that. And you're going to continue going back and back and back through the processing chain until you get to something where there's actually going to be some movement. But it should just be a conversation like anything else, empathetic, reasonable, and there's no reason that you can't debate a Calvinist. There's nothing in the rule book that says that's off limits just because they don't think free will exists.
Plus, if they start, they can't quit. It's like, oh, well, we've got this started. You have to keep going. It's a moral imperative.
That's right.
Yeah, there have been some long discussions with my parents, and ultimately it comes back to something along these lines of like faith. And where does faith come from? Well, it comes from God. And if you don't believe, that's because God hasn't revealed it to you. I was like, I don't. Yeah, I guess you can claim that if you want, but I don't really know where to go from that.
How do you know that?
Because God
starts
told them.
With that question.
How do they know that God told them? Because God told them.
How do you know that God told them? Oh, see, that's so fun. I think that's really fun. Like that is a real logic loop. That is a real example of like seeing human brains working algorithmically. I used to talk about this. Have you ever heard of an ant death spiral? I think Matt and I have had this conversation already before. But the ants have an algorithm where they follow
a chain of ants starts following each other, basically.
Yeah. Ants. They look very intelligent or they look very organized, but they just use a very simple algorithmic rule to follow a pheromone trail. Whenever one finds some food, they drop a different pheromone trail and they go back to the nest, and then somebody else. The ants sort of haphazardly move in their environment, but they happen to come across that pheromone trail. They'll follow that. They'll follow the food and they'll come back. And over time, you end up with this it looks like organized behavior where they're all going to the food source and bring it back to the nest, and it's very beneficial. Unfortunately, somebody can just step over a bad rock or go around a wrong twig, and they'll accidentally cause a loop. And then the whole nest will leave the nest and enter into a spiral, and they'll just die. They just march until they die because they can't find their way back home. That's just because their minds are working off, if you could call them minds, they're working off algorithmic rule sets. And I find that's really interesting that can happen in one of these faith conversations, especially if you're talking about God being the source of your free will. You can get stuck in a little logic loop and there's no way out of it. There's no way out of it if you can't brute force your way out of it, because this is an example of top-down versus bottom-up processing. The only way to get them out of it is to get them to see that it is a logic loop, is to get them to go one step higher in the abstraction hierarchy, which you can do just through conversation. But it's a fun time. That's a fun conversation to have. I wouldn't avoid that. That's a really fun place to play around with the way we think about things.
Moving the conversation one step removed is almost always necessary when you're talking about people, when we're talking about things like religion, conspiracy theories, where it becomes part of the identity, because they're already going to be on the defensive. So instead of saying, hey, let's talk about God and free will, let's just talk about how you can know this. Hey, I had this experience the other day. What do I know about it and how do I know about it? Because getting them to recognize that God told them, that might mean they read a holy text and are interpreting that as if God, printed that message for them. Or maybe it's a feeling that they got that they attribute to God. Maybe it's a voice that they didn't hear audibly but heard in their head that they attribute to God. Maybe it's actually a voice they heard audibly and attribute to God. There are many different reasons why somebody might say, oh, God told me. And so it's always going to be worth asking, what do you mean by that? Because the different answers are going to tell you a lot about the person you're interacting with and what course of conversation is most likely. If it's not going to tell you which course of conversation is going to be most likely to change their mind, it can often at least tell you which ones to avoid, because there's fewer things that are more ridiculous than sitting down arguing with a Catholic but talking about Baptist doctrine, or the opposite. Sitting down with a Baptist and talking about transubstantiation, because they're going to laugh at you and they're going to, the Mary worshiping Catholics, of course, that stuff's not real. They all had the wrong God.
That's so true. That's and as Matt's saying, that's the difference between topic rebuttal and technique rebuttal. Or if you want to get out of those technicalities, that's the difference between arguing at the level of conclusions versus the level of processing. So if you just sit there with facts at this person saying, this is because of this, And you can argue about that forever because you're arguing at they've already concluded the processing chain. Like you're not moving back through there to say, well, why did you think that? How did you come to that conclusion? What about, and then you can, and if you move up another level into like whatever their abstractions are, like you're like, what categorically kind of thinking is this? How does it apply to other places in your life? That's the way to get to those topics.
Hopefully that was helpful, Ashley. I don't envy the conversations you're likely to have, but hopefully thinking about things in these terms will make them go much better.
Yeah, I don't know. There's been a lot of discussions, and I'm sure there will be many to come. So we'll see how things go. But,
well, call back and let us know how they go in the future. You want to drop us like a bad habit? Get on with it, Ashley. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for checking out this clip for The Line. While you're here, hit that like button, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and then share this with that bitter uncle of yours who loves talking about the good old days.